Can't believe I almost forgot to record. Thank you. Thank you, Michaela. Okay, so now we're recording. And again, we're talking about the New South. We're going to talk about how the South went from that Reconstruction era to modern day. Mr. Guest forgot to do it earlier. Yeah, so I almost forgot. I appreciate that. Appreciate you calling me out, guys. Because then I'm going to have to do this later again. So that was just the thing, right? The South and the Reconstruction and how they change. What stays the same and what changes up until 1898, 1900. That's where we're going to stop. And we're going to go a little bit past that to get into some topics. So first, key points. Despite industrialization in some segments of the Southern economy, agriculture based on sharecropping and tenant farming continued to be the primary economic activity in the South. So during Reconstruction and after Reconstruction, there's going to be a push to build things and change the South, right? Make a new South. And even though that happens to an extent, the South is still going to go back to relying on the things that make them the most money, the things that they've done since the beginning, right? And that's agriculture. But instead of slavery, they use sharecropping and tenant farming. So I'll give you a quick minute and a half to get that down. And if somebody can, really briefly in the chat, or off, you can come off mute and say it either way. What is sharecropping? I feel like I've been talking about sharecropping forever, but I'm going to keep saying it because it's really important and some people forget it. What is sharecropping? So again, minute and a half for the key point. Actually, I'll give you 2 minutes for the key point. And then what is sharecropping? Somebody, anybody, when you're done. A cycle of debt based on what? You are right. A cycle of debt is what it is. Now, who is the money owed to? Like, who's holding the debt? Who's the person in charge? Who's the person running that? Right? Like, what's the type of person that runs that? Not the government. The government does not do it. Landowners, wealthy landowners, right? Wealthy landowners are renting out small plots of land. Actually, it's here explained really well. Yeah, rent out small plots of land. And then it's like a debt circle for reasons that we're not going to get into right this second because we've talked about it on previous slides and it's in your other notes, or at least it should be. But it's a debt cycle. It's like debt slavery is what some like postmodern historians will call it. And I tend to hesitate to call it that because that's a little, not that it's not that, but just be careful with mixing it up with slavery. That's more black codes and other things, right? But it's a cycle of debt and it makes the sharecropper, right? The person renting the land never able to become economically independent. They're never able to become independent of the landowner. The landowner still has practically, still has a boot on their neck, if that makes sense. And that's the most important part about the system. That's what it is. And that's what's going to take hold in the South, regardless of the small minor changes that are being made. Combining words there. About 20 seconds if you need minor. If you need more time, let me know. I know I'm mixing words up. Small, minor. I would say, yeah, it's definitely spelled sminer, like a minor, S-M-I-N-E-R. No, it'd be spelled sminer. You're right. Yeah, the first one was right. S-M-I-N-O-R. Don't write it down like that. Okay, so let's move forward. And let's get into what the New South Plan is. Henry Gray, which is a writer for a newspaper called the Atlantic Constitution, laid out this vision for a new Southern United States. I don't know why United States isn't there. I think I cut it off when I was moving things around. The goal is to focus on a future for the South that is based on industrialization and infrastructure, right? Remember, part of why the South loses in the Civil War is because they have no industry and no infrastructure. Southern states will pass New England in textiles and construction of new railroads and telegraph lines. Man, that was right on time, right? But the New South mentality only takes hold in a few places and cities. Most of the South will remain agricultural, and sharecropping will take like a hold in those regions. So I don't have any figures for you, and I don't really have any specific cities to name, but you can like imagine the Southern US, like old cities. Think of big cities in there like Atlanta. I said I didn't have cities and I'm going to name some, right? Or think of other cities like maybe you would say, Nashville is another one. Major cities in southern states like that. South Carolina states like Charleston and stuff, that those big cities will industrialize. Some of them will, not all of them. And don't write down the names I'm saying because I'm not sure if they industrialized during this time. So be careful with names of cities. You just need to know what the concept is, right? That some cities will take hold and they will use this. They'll take this, they'll run with it. But most of the South sticks to agriculture. So this New South plan it's a plan in theory. It's probably a good plan, but it never really takes hold. It never really transforms the South the way Henry Grade wants it to. So what do you need for this slide? You need to know what the South plan is, what the New South plan is. You need to know that in some places it works, in other places it doesn't. I'll give you about 2.5 minutes for this slide. So again, most of the South stays agricultural. This doesn't really change the entire South. It changes small cities in key areas. And this is all throughout the Gilded Era, mind you. Like this newspaper date is from pre-Reconstruction ending when this stuff happens, and this movement will take hold for a little while, but it won't last long. New Orleans, another city I think of that industrializes. But again, don't focus too much on the city names, focus more on the idea, the concept. I'm naming cities to just kind of give you an idea of what they might have looked like during the time. My Red Dead Redemption video game players, that's why the city in New Orleans that they're in that game, and the second one is like it looks like a modern city almost, even though it's 1890. And that's why when you go away outside of it, like literally 2 seconds away, it's like nothing. That's actually kind of how the South was built. Some of the cities look practically modern, like top of the line. And the rest of the South is like if you went back in time. And that's basically that's like the failure of this plan, right? It doesn't take hold everywhere. In fact, it only takes hold in a few places. About 40 seconds, and then we're going to move on to the next key point. This is a short key point. This was just one piece of info for you. And I will say we are going to get into some heavy topics today. Specifically, this next key point has some heavy stuff. There are some images in there. Just fair warning. But I've said it before and I will say it again. I do not censor primary sources. I think this is important stuff that people should know. Young people like yourselves. So we are going to talk about it. And if you have questions, feel free to ask. That being said, let's move on to the next key point. So, Supreme Court decision, Plessy versus Ferguson. We've talked about this already, but what does it do? It upholds racial segregation, makes segregation constitutional. And it helped mark the end of most political gains African Americans made during Reconstruction. If you remember, when we talk about Reconstruction, right, there's all this positive, right? Representatives being elected, a governor being elected, all of this awesome stuff is happening in these southern states. Why is all the awesome stuff happening? Who's there to make sure it happens? Somebody in the chat tell me, or somebody come off mute and say it. Why is everything going so well initially during Reconstruction and throughout Reconstruction? Somebody tell me. If you don't remember, put don't remember. But in the chat, think about it. Why is it happening? Who's there? Who's making sure that all of this positivity is taking place? Who's making sure all the laws are being enforced correctly in the South? Think about it. By the way, 2 minutes. I'll give you 2 minutes. Yeah, Alex, you nailed it. The military, right? The army is in the South. They're occupying the South still post-Civil War. And they're making sure federal law and the Constitution is being upheld. But when they leave in 1877, there's a vacuum, and Southerners in a lot of places, there's a few ways you can describe it. I've heard it described as they're trying to stake it to the federal government. I've heard it described as they're trying to secure power again. It's probably a mixture of a bunch of things, mainly being that finally these old Southerners, right, because they've been Southerners for a long time, are able to take power into their own hands, and they're going to use it. They're not going to care what the law is. They're going to make their own laws. And part of how that starts is with Plessy versus Ferguson, which we're going to get into in about a minute. So you have about a minute to get this key point down. And they're going to keep changing laws. Black codes are gone. Reconstruction gets rid of those. But you're going to hear a new set of laws known as Jim Crow laws. And those are going to be created post-Reconstruction. And those are going to be around well into the 1960s. And they start here in the 1880s, 1870s. About 30 seconds. And again, if you have any questions, let me know. The stuff we're going to get into is going to be a little bit intense, but it's important. All right, let's move forward. So first, we're going to talk about segregation. With the exception of this Compromise of 1877 cartoon, these are all real images. Most of these were taken after this. So these are later images, but the fact that it's later doesn't change it. If anything, it makes it worse, right? Racial segregation takes place once federal troops are removed. It's pretty much what your key point says, right? After the Compromise of 1877, federal troops are gone. There's no one there to enforce federal law. That's not new information. You should know that already, so you don't necessarily need to write that. If you're not sure, if you didn't remember, maybe write it again. But what you need to know is what Plessy versus Ferguson does. And that is a Supreme Court case that makes racial segregation constitutional as long as the facilities were separate but equal. You're going to hear that term separate but equal come up a lot. Let me tell you something right now. Facilities were never equal. Every single public facility that could be segregated was segregated. And it was the law of the land. It was okay. The Supreme Court ruled that it was all right. And basically the way this case came in was Ferguson, who was 1/8 African-American, sat in the white train car and refused to leave. And he was a lawyer, and so he sued and he fought the case all the way to Supreme Court where he lost. And yeah, segregation became law, became the law of the land. And that was not only affecting Black people, even though it mostly affected Black people. It affected a lot of Hispanics. Like, I think I've told you guys some of the stories about my grandmother being a migrant worker in the 50s and 60s. And she has stories of seeing like the no Mexicans allowed signs, right? Where there were Mexicans, there was made about Mexicans in the Southwest and places in California and all these other places, Arizona, Texas. This doesn't just affect one minority group, it affects a lot of them. And again, segregation was okay, it was law. So don't think that it doesn't just affect one group, it affects many groups. Yeah, my grandmother, worked in the fields a lot too. They would drive around, right, and work in fields, and it's intense, guys, and this is all real. This happened. These images from segregation of the water fountains and stuff, these are probably from the 40s and the 50s even. I would say they're probably not in the 60s just because of actually that one, the one right underneath the Imperial Laundry might be from the 60s, but the other one's probably 50s. But this is not that long ago. My grandmother is still around. My grandmother still to this day, and she's very in her ways. But I'll give you an example. Like when I went to school in College Station, we would stop in these little towns and we'd have lunch or whatever. And if she looked around and she doesn't see any other, for lack of a better term, like minorities, right? Like she's really comfortable with African Americans, she's comfortable with other Hispanics. But if she didn't see anybody else at a table and it was a full restaurant, this is obviously way pre-pandemic, she was uncomfortable and you could see it. She'd just be like a little uncomfortable, not because anything was going to happen, right? It was whatever it was, 2011, 2012, but because she's had stuff happen to her like that so many times in the past, right? That it's just uncomfortable to her. She's the type of person that to this day gets a little annoyed when she sees people on like daytime television shows making tacos and they can't say the stuff correctly. Like they, they're, like she always trashes Gwyneth Paltrow, who I think was an Iron Man, for making like vegan tacos and stuff. Cause she's like, that's, whatever, like that's my culture and stuff. My point is this stuff is real. So I'm telling you that just to point, it's reached a lot of people. It was horrible, horrible, horrible for the African-American populations in these states. This is what it was designed for. It affects those other groups as a result. Does that make sense? It's designed to take away the progress that was made with Reconstruction. So I'm going to move on. I'll give you a few more seconds to grab a screenshot if you need it. And we're going to get into Jim Crow. And we're going to specifically talk about lynch mobs and lynching. And then we're going to talk about how it affected other parts of the country. So I'm going to warn you again. If you don't want to see the slides, you can, mute the Zoom call, but still listen. Still take the notes. You try to look up the slides later, or if you want a copy of slides that doesn't have the images on it, you got to let me know through Teams and I'll send you them. But these are images and these are real. So you've been warned. So Jim Crow, what is a Jim Crow law? You need to write everything on this slide. Jim Crow laws are strict, racist laws that are designed to take the rights away from freed blacks. That's what they're designed for. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. That's not up for dispute. Some examples: blacks can serve on juries, couldn't run for public office. Many advances and strides made by blacks during Reconstruction were just taken away, just canceled. And on top of that, you had groups of people called lynch mobs that would go around and hang people without repercussions. If you were in a lynch mob, obviously you were white probably, and you were perfectly fine to do what you were doing. Many blacks wouldn't even see a trial because once they were accused of a crime, regardless of how guilty they were, and a lot of times they weren't guilty, and that's not even hyperbole, I mean it. Most of the time they weren't guilty. Lynch mobs would get formed and they'd be hung. These are real images of lynched individuals. This was in Waco, Texas. This is a postcard like, hey, went to the lynch mob, killed a African-American farmhand. He was 15 years old. Write me back, sent it off. These are real things that happened. Again, that postcard one is from Waco, Texas. I believe the top one is Mississippi, but I could be wrong. So I'll leave this slide up for about 2 minutes because you need the info on it. You need to know about the Jim Crows. You need to know about lynch mobs. You need the info. Again, you don't need it word per word. You can paraphrase it, but you do need all the info. You need to know what they did and you need to know what happened. Do not pull punches on Jim Crow. Jim Crow is designed to take away rights. That's the point. About a minute and a half. We're going to shift a little bit and we're going to talk specifically about the Southwest in the United States, places like Texas especially. And we're going to talk about how lynching was still a thing over there, and what would happen to a lot of Hispanics that owned land, a lot of the Mexicans that still held land post Texas Revolution and things like that, and why they don't hold it anymore. Why a lot of the big ranches have names like Yaturia and King, and not names like Sanchez or Gomez, even though they probably did in 1837. This is not me throwing shade at those families, by the way. This is stuff that would have happened a while ago, but it's a lot of families have a story. Hispanic families from those regions have stories about like, oh, the great grandfather that was. Well, we're gonna get into it. I won't spoil it. 30 seconds. All right, we're gonna move forward. So, in other parts like the Southwest and Texas, lynching occurred not often for the same reasons. And what I mean by that is a lot of the lynchings in places like Texas, especially, were driven by land acquisition and corruption. Texas Rangers used to tie people up and drag them through cactuses off horses. They used to incite violence, and then once the landowner acted out, they would kill them, and then they would give that land, distribute that person's land to new families coming in from other parts of the country. Again, these are real. A lot of these things happened well into the Gilded Age and beyond, and it's happened for a long time. It's why during the Hispanic rights movement, which we will talk about later on when we get there, you still have Hispanics fighting groups like Texas Rangers. You don't need to write this down. This is extra information about the region that we're from, right? You don't need to write this down. I'm sorry, I didn't say that at the top. Just know this happened not everywhere. Should stress that. This happened in different places and it didn't always look the same. That's about it for here. So again, just know that this is going to keep happening. When we get into the civil rights movement, there's a really good topic that we will talk about Texas Rangers and voter suppression and how even into the 1960s, those guys were still kind of, not quite okay with equality. So let's move forward. Last key point of the day. This is a shorter lesson today. It's kind of heavy info. So facing increased violence, discrimination, and scientific theories of race, and I mean that literally. There's all sorts of race theories that will come out about why one race is superior to the other. African American reformers will continue to fight for political and social equality. That never goes away. I know it's hard to. Well, I shouldn't say it's hard to. It's easy for some people to perceive African Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans as just victims, but that is not the case. Sure, they were victims, but the resistance doesn't stop. It takes a long time for it to stop. And in the case of like African Americans, right, they never stopped until they got what they want. And you could make the argument if they still, you could make that argument in a government or political theory class whether they did ever get what they want, but that's not an argument for here. The point is during this time period and beyond, resistance will continue. And then we're going to talk about 3 specific members that resisted in different ways. So I'll give you a minute and a half for this key point, and then we'll get into the last slide. About a minute left. So again, if you're going to need more time on this, go ahead and grab a screenshot. We have about 45 seconds, and then we will move on to the last key points. I believe it's the last key point. Could be wrong. No, yeah, last one after this. Last slide, I should say. All right, we're going to go ahead and move forward. So, resistance. Even though times were unfair, resistance never ends. 3 people. Ida B. Wells wrote against lynching and Jim Crow laws, received lots of death threats, very obviously, for her work. Eventually, a mob will destroy her presses, her printing presses, where she printed out her newspapers, but she escapes to the north and continues to write. Ida B. Wells is really awesome. We will probably look at some of her sources, some of her writing a little later. Henry Turner helped to facilitate a movement to send Black Americans to Liberia. But it was a not sustainable venture. It's not easy to live in Liberia. Liberia is in Africa, by the way. Kind of like make a colony out there. It wasn't a great idea, but some people really, really got behind it. Then you have a guy named Booker T. Washington. He's a very controversial figure in the fight for equality. He felt like blacks needed to become self-sufficient economically, and that would lead to power in the voting booth. He's not worried about like, hey, change these things. He's like, no, you pick yourself up, do better, and it will lead to power in the voting booth. He went to great lengths to help many, many, many African Americans do this. His vision is seen as impractical by many for a few reasons. Some of the easier ones to explain are that while he was a former slave and was able to do the things that he did and, make himself financially independent and be able to have power as an individual, the South is not a very African American friendly place post Reconstruction. And a lot of the means and methods to become economically independent are not openly available to most people, right? Because even poor whites are stuck being sharecroppers, but especially to African Americans. So keep that in mind as you move forward at WWE. Yeah, I know. I always wondered if I'm assuming Booker T got that wrestling name from this guy, but I have no way of knowing that. And then, King Booker. That's funny. Good stuff. You're good. No worries. But so, I'll give you about 3.5 minutes because there's 3 big figures and you do need to get each one of them. And over the weekend, I will make sure there's a Quizlet up for the topics we covered this week, mainly the West and the New South. And that'll be up by Monday. So if you guys like to review on Quizlet, that'll be available. Again, if you haven't joined that Quizlet class, you might want to. Free vocabulary terms. Easy peasy. Lemon squeezing. 3 minutes, and then we will get into the exit ticket and what we are going to close out today with. Again, shorter lesson day. Don't start your exit ticket yet. We're going to talk about it first, and then we'll get into it. About 2 minutes. About 1.5 minutes. 1 minute. All right, so that is time. If you need a little bit more than that, make sure you grab a screen grab of the slide. We're going to go ahead and move forward. Okay, so exit ticket time. So we go over to the Google Classroom. New South exit ticket should already be posted for everybody. It is a Google form. Make sure you put your name. Do not forget, if you don't put your name, I'm not going to give you credit. So put your name on it. And then you just, the source, it's the same source for all three questions. This one has a gap in the middle. Don't mind that. Just answer the questions. These are MCQs. AP multiple choice questions. Shouldn't take you more than 3 minutes to do this. So make sure you get it done. I'm actually going to keep everybody here for about 5 minutes. Get this done. There's 50 some of you here. That means everybody should get it done. 5 minutes, go. You don't have to put anything where it says your answer for the reading. That's just the source. I had to put it as a question. So don't put anything for your answer. Just skip that. Don't worry about that. Good question. But yeah, skip that part. Don't worry about that. Just use the source if you need it. Again, 5 minutes shouldn't take you more than that. It's already on the clock. We got one person who turned it in. Awesome. Keep going. About 4.5 minutes. About 4 minutes.